talk to you about Jugaad Innovation. How many of you have heard this term Jugaad before? A few of you? Few of you? Okay. And I want to talk to you about innovation in general because the word innovation, it gets really watered down, right? It's attached to everything, things that don't matter much, maybe. Things like cupcakes, things like cigarettes, right? Innovation gets attached to everything, but I think part of the reason I'm so excited about being here today is that when you attach the word innovation to healthcare, and you really think about what that intersection means, it's right there at the top of the list in terms of how we can impact global pressing problems more than almost anything else. And so in that spirit, I want to have this conversation with you today, in part because I actually have a healthcare background. People often ask me if the doctor is a PhD. It's not. It's a doctor of dental surgery. And that doctor of dental surgery has served me well in many ways, but it turned out not to be in the dental clinic. People also ask me, why did you leave dentistry? And there are a couple of reasons. So one is I love talking to people. So you can imagine, maybe some of the innovators here can help us solve that problem, but that was pretty hard in a dental practice. I like to understand what makes people tick. The other reason was a pretty severe bout of typhoid. And I'm not going to get into that here, but I'll be out at the Hive later if anybody wants to talk about that. But I do think that having a healthcare background and not a traditional, coming up through the sort of traditional canons of business has given me a different perspective on what innovation means. And as I was learning about innovation and what is it, whose job is it, how can it help us solve problems, I really used to read, and still do, everything I can get my hands on to think about these things. And one of the things I noticed, and I'm sure some of you here might feel the same way, is you read things and you think, I feel like I've heard that before. I feel like that's really similar to something I've seen before. It just kind of repackaged in a different way. And it always reminded me of magazines like this one, where you essentially have the same content over and over again, but still buy the magazine, right, sometimes. So I thought it'd be fun to see what it looked like if we replaced the word sex and weight loss with innovation. So here's what it looks like. This is Jeff Bezos. He's our cover boy of innovation, talking about late night innovation and creativity under $10. So all of this to say that innovation is extremely important, and let's have a little fun today. I take my work very seriously. Maybe I don't take myself as seriously just because I think engagement is a big part of this process, and I think that's something that all of you are seeing here today. Just connecting with each other is a part of what's going to make your innovation initiatives move forward. This is sort of the traditional definition of innovation. This is Joseph Schumpeter. Who remembers this guy from economics? A couple of people were paying attention back then. Yeah, maybe he wasn't the easiest guy to remember, but he's the person that gave us sort of this traditional definition of innovation, which is the successful commercial exploitation of new ideas. So the new ideas part is usually pretty clear to folks. The commercial exploitation part sounds, what does that mean? Well, it means that it's not just an idea that I have on a piece of paper and it's in my back pocket. It's not the prototype that's in my garage. It's something that actually met the needs of the marketplace, right? So this is the difference between invention and innovation. Okay, this is the difference between invention and innovation. And when we think about Schumpeter, I think about traditional innovation. And by that I mean how we typically innovated in resource-rich environments. And typically, that's done through R&D, right? Research and development. So it's usually pretty expensive. It's more linear in its approach, and it's usually top-down. So it's done by the people whose job it is to innovate, kind of the guys in the white coats, so to speak. Okay? Anybody have a T-shirt like this when they were growing up? My mom and dad went to the Bahamas, and all I got was this lousy T-shirt. Well, the traditional approach really isn't working in the way that it used to anymore for so many reasons. Because we're facing an era of complexity now, right? Things are getting more complicated. We have a fast-paced global environment that's extremely volatile. We're more connected. It's global. All of these things are really creating that urgency that was mentioned earlier for a new approach to innovation. This is actually from a Booz & Company report they do every year where they look at the 1,000 companies that spend the most on R&D. And what they found is that last year they spent over $630 billion on innovation, but they didn't get those breakthroughs or game changers that Deb was talking about earlier. They got really more the incremental innovations. And by incremental innovations, I mean more like the vanilla Coke of innovations, right? The things we label them as innovative, but they're really not. Right? So that old approach, it's not going to work anymore. It's not to say that resources aren't valuable, but rather to rethink when are resources important. And I would argue, and today we'll talk about how sometimes having fewer resources can actually enhance your ability to innovate. The other reason for the urgency around kind of a new approach to innovation is because, and all of you in healthcare are seeing this, right? Customers want more value, but at the same time, they want more customization. They want things that really speak to them and their needs. That's a tall order. That's a tall order. How are we going to address this? Is it a paradox that we can even solve for? How are we going to provide high value and high quality at a lower cost? I think the answer is through frugal innovation, or what I would call Jugaad innovation. This is Dr. Ari Mishelkar. So he is a scientist who's based in India. He works with innovation groups all over the world, and he actually coined this phrase several years ago, frugal innovation. And he says it means value for money, okay, high value at a low cost, but also value for many. And I think that value for many piece is extremely important, because it shares a few things about frugal innovation that don't happen in the traditional approach to innovation. One is, who's participating in this process? Who are we partnering with? Who are we collaborating with? How do our customers get involved, right? The beauty of that is we heard about a lot of that this morning. More and more, we understand that innovation inside these four walls will only get us so far. If we really want breakthroughs, we have to partner. We have to collaborate. We have to bring in our patients, right? The other value for many piece is about accessibility. We talk about rising healthcare costs. How do we create high value and high quality healthcare, but make it accessible because it costs less, because it's less complex, it's easier to understand. So that value for many piece, to me, is extremely fundamental to what frugal innovation is and how it's different from the traditional approach to innovation in resource-rich environments. So Jugaad. Most of you have not heard this word before. You want to try saying it? Jugaad. Yeah, that's good. So Jugaad is a word that I learned about. I spent about 8 months in India researching the approach to innovation of mostly grassroots entrepreneurs, but also corporations, some of them multinational, some of them headquartered out of India, and thinking about how does innovation happen even if we don't have a lot? Because it certainly does. It's not always easy, but we do solve problems even if we don't have resource constraints. And as I was doing my research, my team in India, I actually had a US team and an India-based team. The team in India was interesting because as we were going along, anytime we'd run into a problem, so it could be a financial issue, or running out of budget, we're running out of time, we literally don't have good infrastructure, they'd say, it's okay, we'll do some Jugaad. And I kept thinking, what is this Jugaad? And whatever it is, let's do some of it, because we've got to get out of this fix pretty quickly. And what I learned is that Jugaad is an improvised solution. It's really leveraging ingenuity to solve problems, to think about not what we don't have, but what we do have. That was a big, big mindset shift for me personally. I was trained as a scientist right here in the US. I got a great education, no doubt about it. But that improvisation piece, that ability to think about not only a solution, but multiple solutions and maybe multiple paths to solutions, that was hard for me. It took me a while to learn that. So Jugaad Innovation is a frugal, flexible, and inclusive approach to innovation that's inspired by emerging markets, but increasingly, we're seeing it used more and more in the US and other developed economies. So one of the most interesting things I learned over the course of my research over the last several years is that Jugaad is not unique to India. This concept of leveraging ingenuity, of being resourceful, of being flexible in your thinking, it's all over the world, especially in developing economies. Okay, so there are different words for this. Not exactly the same, but similar kind of idea. So in China, it might be called Zizhu Chuangjin. In Kenya, it might be called Juakali. In Brazil, Gambiara. Okay, and I would say in the US, it's most like DIY, do-it-yourself, right? We are hearing about the rise of the do-it-yourself culture in every arena, okay? And that includes healthcare. I mean, how many solutions, how many hacked healthcare solutions are out there? How many powerful solutions are emerging out of garages, essentially, right? Because of the power of technology, because of the connectedness that people have today. This is something to pay big attention to, because people aren't necessarily only looking to large organizations to solve their problems anymore, right? So it's not always just the corporations or the academic institutions or the governments that are helping solve problems. Sometimes it's the lone entrepreneur who can have these breakthroughs. And I think the challenge for large organizations isn't how we push them away. How do we bring them in? How do we enroll them into our process? How do we bring them into our four walls so that we can begin to and continue to disrupt ourselves? People often ask me, why is this kind of innovation so prevalent in emerging markets? And I would say scarcity is the biggest reason. So they say that necessity is the mother of invention, right? Scarcity is the grandmother of Jugaad innovation, no doubt about it. And that could be access to affordable capital, that could be infrastructure, it could be time. And unfortunately, in emerging markets, if you don't solve a problem, it could be a matter of life or death, right? So scarcity is a huge, huge driver of frugal innovation. As I conducted my research over the years and interviewed all these entrepreneurs and corporate leaders from primarily emerging markets, thinking about how do you solve problems without having a lot, we distilled out 6 principles. And I'm not going to share them all with you today. They're listed in the book that some of you have, Jugaad Innovation. I want to share 3, though, that I think are going to most benefit you in this conversation and helping you think about what is my role here at United Health Group as an innovator. Okay? The first one is keep it simple. This is absolutely my favorite because it has the most relevance in a corporate context. This is about complexity reduction. This is about thinking about a simple design. So be it a product, be it a service, be it a business model, what does our core need? What does our user really need? What is at the foundation of that, and how do we solve for that problem? Not what features can we add on because it's cool or because it's new technology. How do we best solve the problem in a very focused way? The second one is think and act flexibly, and I put that in there because this is the one that truly was the biggest challenge for me, and actually somebody was just asking me the other day, what is the hardest thing for you to teach when you introduce Jugaad Innovation to corporations in the US? And it's really this ability to think flexibly. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying when we grow up in resource-rich environments, when we always have running water, when we always have consistent electricity, when we probably can get a little bit more budget, it doesn't necessarily require us to think improvisationally in the way that people who haven't had those resources, consistent resources, have to do. The third is include the margin. This is the inclusivity piece, and this is what I really like because I'm already seeing it here, just by virtue of the fact that everybody's invited to the meeting. So if you work at a call center, if you help with cleaning, whatever your role is, you might have an idea, and I think that speaks to your innovation challenge. Anybody can enter that innovation challenge. And when we start to get that kind of diversity of thought, it really enhances our ability to innovate. Okay? It is important to have innovation groups. It is important to have focus and dedicated resources for innovation, but a lot of people here, a lot of you are very closely connected to your end users and have great ideas that this organization can help you move forward. I want to share with you a story of someone I met a few years ago who to me really embodies what Jugaad Innovation is. This is Mansukh Prajapati. He's a tea seller turned entrepreneur who lives in the Rann of Kutch. So this is a desert in Western India. It's obviously extremely hot. It's a very challenging environment. And it's one where markets, like for food, don't come very often, maybe once a week or so. And there's very sporadic access to electricity, okay? And once I met Mansukh Bhai, I understood something about this idea of being ingenious, right? Leveraging resourcefulness, because he started to solve the problem of how do we cool food without electricity, and how do we do that in such a way that it's a very low cost? And he came up with something called a Mitti Cool. It's a $40 clay refrigerator that uses absolutely no electricity, and it's totally green. So I'm going to show you a little bit more of a story in this short video.
2001 में गुजरात में भूकंप आया और ये इधर का जो कहने का मतलब क्या है, पत्रकार वो संदेश पेपर में उसने एक फोटो दिया, हमारा मटका फूट गया और इसने इसमें लिखा है कि गरीबों का फ्रिज का भूखा। तो मैंने सोचा ये एक जो मटका जो गरीबों के लिए फ्रिज हो सकता है, तो सही में गरीबों के लिए मैं फ्रिज क्यों नहीं बनाऊं? तो मैंने ये रेड मॉडल पहले बनाया। इसमें 18 लीटर पानी आते हैं पीने के लिए और ये नल से पीते हैं पानी, और अंदर 5 दिन तक सब्जियां और फ्रूट बिगड़ते नहीं।
5 दिन?
5 दिन तक।
With starting capital of less than $1,000, Mansukh Bhai had not just invented a clay refrigerator, he'd invented a whole new way of working with clay, a brand new industrial process.
हमारा जो मिट्टी है, हम डायरेक्ट जो नॉर्मल लोग बनाते हैं, ये डायरेक्ट मिट्टी का पाउडर बना के इसमें पानी डाल के बनाते हैं। हम क्या करते हैं, पहले इसको लिक्विड बनाते हैं, लिक्विड के बाद सुखाते हैं, सुखाने के बाद हम इसको मिक्सिंग करते हैं पग मिल में।
There's a very good reason so many local women choose to spend their days and all of their free time in Mansukh Bhai's workshop. They're here to learn how to work with clay and how to make molds to cast beautiful clay artifacts.
પેલા માટી કેવી હતી એ ઓળખી લીધી, પછી મોલ બનાવવાનું શીખ્યા અમે કે મોલ કેવી રીતના બનાવવાનું છે। हम 4 महीने से आ रहे और 2 महीने बाद सर्टिफिकेट मिलेगा, इसलिए 2
And the government-approved certificates give these women a profession to be proud of and an additional source of income. Mansukh Bhai may not have an MBA or a PhD, but his constraint-free mindset allowed him to develop new products and create a new market using traditional materials while improving living conditions for his entire community.
It's inspiring, isn't it? Sometimes we think about, what we don't have. And the truth is, after visiting a lot of grassroots entrepreneurs like Mansukh Bhai, it's really changed the way that I work, and it's made me rethink what it means to have resources. Because resources are all around us, and they don't always have to mean additional headcount or budget. Sometimes they do, no doubt about it. But sometimes it really means, how do I use my own knowledge? How do I use my community to solve problems in a way that's really powerful and create great impact? So let's fast forward here to the US. This is Jane Chen. She grew up in California, and she attended Stanford University's D School or Design School. How many of you have heard of the D School? Quite a few of you. Good. So at the D School, she took a class called Entrepreneurial Design for Extreme Affordability. Okay? And in that class, these are students, they're not people with healthcare expertise, were challenged to solve problems by creating products that are 1% of the traditional cost of a product. 1%. So not affordable, extremely affordable. And you can imagine, this is not a cost out exercise, right? Sometimes we think about how do we remove 5% or 10% cost. But when you think about how do we remove 99% of the cost to solve the same problem, now you're going to do a whole reset. Now you're going to have to build from the ground up, not kind of strip, defeature, something that already exists, okay? So Jane and her colleagues were looking at infant mortality due to hypothermia in Nepal. And what they realized is that this rate was extremely high. They also realized that people weren't using traditional incubators. So when they went there to learn why, they found through a really empathy-based approach that a lot of the incubators were in disrepair, right? They're too complex. People can't get parts. There's not consistent access to electricity for those hospitals who do have them. The other thing they learned is that 80% of the babies are born at home. How's an incubator, a traditional incubator, have any relevance for those families? It simply doesn't. So what they did is through this empathetic approach, they came back and designed something, a portable infant warmer called Embrace. And it's really more like a sleeping bag than a box, right? And what I love about this baby warmer is that there are two pockets. The baby goes in one, and on the upper pocket, there's a phase change material that stays warm for several hours. And what I love about the phase change material is it's decades old. That's not new. That's not new. It's just kind of a waxy substance that you can heat and maintains consistent heat for a long time. And the reason that's important is because that's also very fundamental to frugal innovation. It's not always about having the latest bells and whistles. It's about how do we reapply something that already exists in a new way. Now, this can be heated through electricity, but it can also be heated with boiling water, which is very important in rural areas where there's not always consistent access to electricity. The other part I appreciate about Jane and her colleagues is their empathetic approach again. They actually went to Nepal and they continued to do their field research to understand how this baby warmer, their baby warmer, was being used. And it had actually really broad acceptance, particularly because it was so accessible. But they also found that a lot of the mothers were keeping the temperature a couple of degrees lower than body temperature. And when they went to find out why, and they talked to the doctors and they talked to the mothers, they found out that the women in these areas felt that Western medicine was too strong. Okay? So if normally they give cough syrup to their child and it recommends a teaspoon, they might only give their child a quarter teaspoon. Same thing here. But what I love about what they did, how did they respond to that, is instead of a temperature gauge on the baby warmer, they put a happy face and a sad face. Okay, not okay. Well, guess what? Everybody wants to be okay. So once they adopted that, right, based on the needs of their customer, they had great compliance. They had great compliance. That's what frugal innovation is. This is about high value. This is about high quality. This is about empathy. This is about accessibility, right? And this example I love so much because this is when I think the good enough solution is actually better. Sometimes good enough is a phrase that's a little tricky to use in healthcare. This isn't about less safety. This is about what we don't need. When I went to GE Healthcare in Bangalore not too long ago, they had an incubator there that was $100,000. There were video screens, there were mobiles. I'm not saying, those may or may not be needed, but what is the fundamental need? This is about, again, that complexity reduction. How do we go extremely simple? Let's go to the core of the problem and solve accordingly. Okay, this is when good enough can be better. And by the way, this has received US FDA approval. And this is being used in hospitals all over the world now, not just for emerging markets. So a lot of the frugal innovations or Jugaad innovations that I've learned about over the course of the years are finding increasing relevance in the US, especially in healthcare. Some of you might recognize this. This is a Mac 400, so this was developed by GE Healthcare. And actually, I had a talk with their chief design officer. They're actually quite good at frugal innovation. He told me that their incubator was a pretty big miss because they didn't pay attention necessarily to what the user needs were at a deep enough level. But with this, they had a huge success. This is a ECG unit that measures heart rhythm, okay? They created this first for the Indian market, but now it's all over the world. They had 10 engineers. They had 9 in India, 1 in the US, and they created something that was so simple and so focused. It was high value and low cost. It was about a fifth of the weight, a tenth of the cost of a traditional ECG unit. It's easy to use. Look at that interface. Their goal was to make this easier to use than a mobile phone, because in India, most people have a mobile phone and know how to use them very well. I think that's a great goal to have because it's extremely simple. Essentially, there's actually one that's even more simple than what you see here. Power, start. That's it. Why is that so important? Because we don't have enough healthcare providers around the world. Access, as we talked about earlier today, is a huge problem. Now, if you can create products and systems that are supported by community members, they don't have to be highly trained medical specialists, you're going to start to flip the model in so many ways. So now, the healthcare provider can go to the patient. The patient doesn't have to go to the healthcare provider, right? Somebody can actually just take this machine, give the test to a patient, bring it back to someone who can read it. Then the results can be shared with the patient. That's a big, big reset in the industry. And a lot of this is being driven by so-called corporate intrapreneurs. How many of you have heard that term, intrapreneurs? Right? I think there are a lot of intrapreneurs in this room, people who are entrepreneurial, but they have the benefit of being in a big corporation. That's what we're talking about today. We're talking about you. What is your role in innovation? Your company is creating pathways for you through an innovation summit, through your innovation challenge. The rest, I think, is up to you. One of the principles I didn't share with you earlier, but that I really like is follow your heart. Because as I'm researching for my next book about corporate entrepreneurs, what I'm finding is that the people who are really passionate about what they're doing, those are the ones who move forward. Whatever resources they have, they just find a way to do it. They reach out to their networks. They find people from other organizations who can support them, and they start to solve really big problems. And that's the opportunity that exists for all of you. And I know that many of you are putting that into action already. City HealthWorks is a really interesting example of a program that helps to manage chronic disease in New York City for people who typically don't have access to consistent health care. And what I found really interesting about this model, because it's based on coaching by your peers, is that I've seen these models in emerging markets for years, where community-based healthcare workers track patients, help patients, whether if it's in the diabetes area, for example, did you take your blood sugar? Are you seeing your appointments? Can I help educate you about nutrition? Do you need groceries? Now we're starting to see these crop up around the US, and City HealthWorks is a great example of this. And what we learn from these models is that when you have people from within the community serving the community, you have better outcomes. They're less likely to leave. They're often more trusted. They can be trained with some fundamental knowledge that can be shared, of course, augmented by healthcare professionals. But these are really powerful models. This is frugal innovation. Who remembers MacGyver? All right, so MacGyver, that's what we're talking about. MacGyver is Jugaad Innovation, right? He was that TV 80s action hero, and he could solve any problem that he was in using what kind of stuff? Duct tape, army knife, exactly. That's kind of what Jugaad Innovation is. Use whatever resources you have to solve even pressing problems, right? Now, MacGyver was fiction, but the reality is your innovation challenge. The reality is DIY. The reality is frugal innovation. Okay? So what's next for everybody here? How are you going to lean into innovation and become a part of something much bigger than yourself? The picture that you see here is a stack of books. When we launched our book in India about 3 years ago, we went on a book tour. And the book was received really well until we saw an editorial in the Times of India. That's pretty much one of the biggest newspapers in India that was with a scathing remarks about us, myself and my co-authors, saying, you know, these consultants and these academics, they come over from the US and the UK, and they're talking about frugal innovation, but they don't even have a paperback book available. And all we could do was hang our heads down and call up our publisher immediately and say, that's a really good point. That's a good point. Can you help us, and can we put out a paperback book? And they said, no. The book's selling really well. We're not going to do that for 6 months. Okay. We continue on our book tour. A few days later, I think about 6, 7 days later, I'm in Mumbai. I'm at Hajeli stoplight. For any of you who have been there, it's one of the longest stoplights in the world. I think it's 7 to 9 minutes that you're typically there, and the cars really start to pile up. So there's a lot of activity in the area. People are selling food, there are things going on, and it's true, and one of the most common things that happen is that usually these young guys will come up to you with a stack of books, okay? And so this very earnest young man came up, he comes to the side of the car, shows me this stack of books, and I look at it, and I was like, oh, there's our book, that's great. How much is it? 800 rupees. And I was like, it's actually 600 in the stores. And I was like, P.S., that's my book. I wrote that. And he's like, 700 rupees. Okay, that's fine. He's got a big smile on his face. I go for it. I take the book. It's a paperback. And I'm thinking, did our publisher move that fast? How did that happen? Anybody have a guess? It's a bootleg copy of the book. That was a bootleg copy of the book. And you know what the lesson is so important. I will stay with me forever. The lesson is, if you don't do it yourself, if you don't disrupt it yourself, someone else will do it for you. And it might not just be the big players that you're used to competing with, right? It might be the roadside publisher. It might be the guy down the street or the gal down the street, right? So that's my message to you today, is lead into it. Remember, scarcity reframed as abundance. You have so much available to you. Sometimes that can get a little cloudy. Hone it in a little bit. Think about what you have in terms of ingenuity, in terms of knowledge, in terms of network, hey, in terms of community. You heard your CEO today. He said, push us. He said, don't complain to us. Push us, right? That's an open invitation, because what he's saying is that I know all of you see exactly what's happening out there. I know that all of you can help us address these issues of how do we address chronic disease, how do we create high value, and how do we make it accessible to people? So with that, I just want to leave it at that. Push the organization, push yourself to lean into it. Thank you very much.